So for Chapter 7, we have a few different concepts to address, so that's why I've divided it into two separate weeks. To get us started, I'm going to go ahead and start with what I call the achievement differences between the genders. Now, so as we start to talk about some of the differences in cognitive ability, achievement, different math ability, spatial ability, we're going to talk a lot in terms of the binary, and unfortunately, the reason being is that most of the research is just addressing our men and women, and often people in the non-binary or trans community are definitely excluded from this research. So as we start to talk about some of these differences, I want to remind ourselves what it means to have a statistically different finding. The key thing is that when we talk about differences, it does not mean that there is no overlap between the two groups. It means that in general there is a mean difference when we look at the group's total in general. When we talk about the differences in math ability, for example, it does not mean that if we were to test every female in the room and every male, that we would always have all males do better than females. What it means is that if we do these mass testings, you see this slight difference in terms of mean scores. But as you can see here, there's still a huge overlap, which means that there's likelihood that many people, regardless of their gender, are doing better or worse than the mean of the group which they represent. So, in essence, it's just a statistically significant sex difference can exist, and there could be differences in the mean scores of the group totals, but yet most of men and women could potentially have very similar ability levels. Alright, so one of the first areas where we do see some achievement differences is in math ability. There's been many studies around why there's this difference between boys and girls and men and women. And in this case, there seems to be the consensus that there continues to be a slight difference between men and women, boys and girls, but that this difference continues to closely approach zero. And one of the reasons behind that is that education for girls has increased and that the gap between equality has also shrunk, therefore decreasing the math ability difference between boys and girls. And in this case, boys having the stronger suit compared to girls. The D is basically the effect size, and that kind of looks at how great the difference is. So the closer it gets to zero, then we know that even though the difference can be statistically significant, that is, that there is a difference in the mean group scores, it is very small. Now, if it was greater, let's say it was D.89, then the difference would be a lot more vast. Now, with math ability, there's a lot of moderators. We're going to start talking about moderators, and as I mentioned before, moderators are basically a third variable that either makes the relationship stronger or weaker. So it's kind of like a leverage. A relationship between A and B is dependent on C, and C would be the moderator in this case. So in this case, for math ability, some of the moderators that have been observed in research has been the gender equality of the country. So the more gender equality a country has, the less the gender differences in math ability are observed. Age is another one. It tends to be that the differences in math ability peak at adolescence with an advantage for males. So for some reason, we don't see as many math ability differences in the earlier years, but in adolescence, that's when you start to see the most difference between the groups. And then the third moderator is the selectiveness of the group. So when we look at the general population, usually you find, again, very small to sometimes even completely absent differences between men and women. But once you move into kind of the more complex math or advanced math, then you see the biggest advantage in terms of males. So males having the greatest advantage in their math ability. Now, the other thing that I want to highlight is that besides the actual ability of people, the attitude towards math seems to be a great factor. And that has been observed in many different studies. One of them that we're going to discuss here by Elsie Quest et al. In 2013 basically looked at 10th grader boys and girls that were in high school. And what they did was they did a very simple study where they observed their achievement. So basically they gave a math test and tested how well they were doing in terms of their math ability. Now, as you can see, across the different groups for white males and females, African American, Latinx people, Asian American, there is no significant difference between the two sexes. In this case, we're using male-female, so we're going to talk about sex. No difference. There are differences among the groups. As you can see, African Americans scoring lower and Latinx people also scoring lower, Asian Americans a little bit on the higher spectrum. Now, when we were asking about their self-concept, that is how well they think they do in math, that's where you're actually seeing the differences. So in this case, there was a difference across all four groups between male and female 10th grade boys and girls. The biggest difference here can be observed in terms of the Latinx community, where males for some reason rate themselves higher in their self-concept of how well they can do math, while females rate themselves lower. And remember, in terms of their achievement, they're doing exactly the same. And I don't want to say that there's a little bit of a slight difference, because this difference is still not significant, so we can't really point it out. But they're basically still doing the same. There is no difference in terms of their achievement. So the question is why? What happens sometime during middle school, late grade school, that there is this shift? Because this same type of trend, it can be observed as early as 2nd and 3rd grade, where you can start to see girls and boys kind of see themselves as being worse or better at math based on because they're a boy or they're a girl. And there are some theories of why that is, but in general, we still don't have the answer. It's not a sure thing of why self-concepts fluctuate so much around math ability. In terms of education tends to be largely the same. So there is a little bit of an edge for females in the last 2 decades, where females have gotten more undergraduate degrees than males. Bachelor degrees, again, still go more to females than males. There is the greatest difference, though, between African American men or Latino males, where they are actually underperforming compared to their female counterparts quite substantially. We call that the education gap in terms of gender in these two groups. Now, once we get into higher education, there continues to be, again, this trend that females are getting more advanced degrees, including master's and doctoral degrees compared to males. The place where we have less of a gender difference is in law and medicine. So in law and medicine, right now, we're about at 50-50. Now, the difference doesn't come into who's achieving what. So as I said, females are definitely getting more degrees in general. If we were to add them all up, there's just a lot more. However, the difference does lie into what type of degrees. So when we look at the percentage, there are some substantial differences. For example, computer information sciences and some of those tech jobs are definitely very much more overrepresented by males compared to females. Engineering is in the 80s again for females. Health professions related fields, again, this is going to take on some of our nursing degrees, some of the other maybe dental hygienist kind of jobs. Psychology, again, also still more dominated by females. So there are some differences in terms of what types of degrees people are getting. And unfortunately, this is a little bit problematic, especially as we move more into a computerized, very technologically informed and dependent kind of community, where in a sense getting a computer science degree is a lot more valuable than, unfortunately, to be completely honest, than a social science degree, probably even including psychology, especially if you're just getting a bachelor's. So there are some implications to these differences that can really lead to other types of discrepancies, including income, and ultimate SES, and just other kind of outcomes that come with what kind of career you have. Now, the reasons why these differences exist are pretty layered. There are some differences that are more individually based. There are some also that are more culturally based. So for the first one, achievement motivation is one of those things that is kind of like an individual factor. So achievement motivation is our tendency to strive for success. And it's been said that there is some differences between women and men and how they approach success and achieving success. In general, there are some differences that are related to some of the gender roles that we play in society. So as we talked about last, men are expected to be agentic, to be successful, to strive hard, to be competitive. Whereas in females, or women, I guess, if we're talking about gender roles, tend to encourage to be a lot more communal, to be more about caregiving, more about community relationships. Therefore, when we have high achieving women, usually that kind of goes against the gender role, and often that comes with repercussions. So what you usually see in the data is that women tend to hide their achievements a little bit more from others. Often they'll say it like it's because I don't want to glow, or it's because, it was nothing, or maybe it felt undeserving. They tend to overcompensate by being overly feminine. So sometimes when you have these very successful women in high achieving places, they still have to carry themselves in a very kind of feminine way. In a sense, there's almost this need to really conquer both being agentic and communal. High achieving women, if they are purely agentic, then similar things happen to that Price Waterhouse case, where there was backlash over Ann Hopkins, who was not promoted to partnership, right? So one of the issues there was that basically she was too agentic and she was not feminine enough. And if they're too communal, also, people who are all about teamwork don't necessarily excel, because a person, what we consider a leader, is really embedded within agentic kind of roles. So, in a sense, in order for women to be high achieving, they have to almost dominate both of those roles in a very smooth and congruent way. So the fear of achievement is another phenomenon that has been associated more with women than with men, where there's this connotation that with success comes negative consequences. Now, in order for a person to have fear of achievement, there are two requirements. So obviously a person needs to be capable of achieving the goal, and there has to be some negative consequences. And it really does impact people who have potential. For example, Horner did a very classical study in 1972. She basically asked a bunch of students to do a story, to project a story based on two characters. The only thing that she changed was basically whether it was Anne or John, and she described them as both as being at top of the class of their medical school. So they were excellent medical school students, and she asked the participants to basically just develop a story about either Anne or John. And what she found, 90% of men wrote positive stories about John, and 65% of women wrote negative stories about Anne. So basically, women were a lot more concerned for Anne's success and the negative repercussions that might come into play, such as she was going to be envied, she was going to be maybe disliked by her peers, she was going to have other kinds of issues that were related to being at the top of the class. Whereas for men who wrote stories about John, everybody thought this was great, and it was just going to be one more path to his success. Some more contemporary evidence about how people sometimes might cut themselves short because of this fear of success is, for example, the switching of the majors. That tends to be more heavily towards women who are in STEM and then switching out of STEM. Whereas in men, they do also switch majors, but often they'll continue to stay within STEM. And the other thing that supports this trend is that once people followed these women who left STEM in their undergraduate degrees, they actually were women who ended up getting advanced degrees. So they went on and got the doctorate, the master's, the JD. So that again tells us that these are very kind of striving, probably very capable women that more than likely would have done well in STEM, but for some reason they moved out of it. Self-confidence is another aspect that seems to also move the sex differences in math ability, and in this case, definitely women tend to underestimate their abilities compared to men. There is the likelihood of wanting to appear modest, and as we remember, being modest, being kind to others, being communal is kind of something that is seen as a traditional woman's role. And And often that could come across as a lack of self-confidence or turn into self. You start to see this lower self-confidence kind of trend in women and girls as young as 4th and 3rd grade, which is actually kind of sad. So here we have a study that was done by Mazzuti and Angoli, where they basically looked at the self-confidence, again, of math scores that students perceived about themselves. So in this case, 2nd and 3rd graders did not have a difference in how well they thought they did in math. But once we reach 4th and 5th grade, you distinctly start to see males rate themselves as more confident in their math abilities than females, with the trend of females of getting worse. And I believe this trend actually ends up getting much worse in middle school. The same kind of trend is observable when you ask these kids about who is better in terms of are girls better than boys or boys better than girls. Now, a lot of social psychology theories would kind of say that usually we kind of select in-group bias. So if you identify as a girl, you would say, well, no, girls are definitely better, or boys are definitely better. Now, if you can see, though, the data kind of shows some other weird kind of trends, which is that at first, in 2nd grade, girls definitely favor girls. So they believe that the females believe that girls are just a lot better at math. Boys kind of think that they're, about the same, or potentially boys might be a little bit better, but they're a little closer to the 0, kind of noting that there might not be a difference, so half and half. 3rd grade, you start to see this little bit of the shift where girls stop saying that girls are better at math than boys. Boys start to own that a little bit more, and then the biggest shift again happens around 4th grade, and it continues on to 5th grade. And in this case, overall, both groups start to have a tendency to believe that boys are better than girls at math. So what happens? I really do not know at all. I've been aware of this research for a long time, obviously, and I have 2 kids, as I've said before, and it was kind of painful to watch this tendency literally happen in front of my eyes, even though I had purposely thought that I had parented in a way where gender wasn't a thing as much in my house. But definitely seeing my daughter again do this shift around 4th to 6th grade, where she was excellent in math and did great, to then believing she was not good at math anymore, even though her grades were great. I don't know where it came from. I don't know how to avoid it, but it did. So that's going to be our discussion this week. We'll be addressing why there continues to be these trends in math abilities and STEM differences between men and women, and how it shows up even at younger ages where school-age kids are already seeing the differences.